Princess Elena had always been different from other royals. While her sisters spent hours learning proper etiquette and practicing their curtsies, Elena preferred reading books about common people's lives and sneaking out to watch the palace workers from her window. She was curious about everything beyond the golden walls that surrounded her. The kingdom of Valdoria was known for its strict traditions. The royal family had followed the same customs for hundreds of years. Every morning, Princess Elena would wake up in her enormous bedroom filled with silk curtains and crystal chandeliers. Her personal servants would dress her in expensive gowns and place a small tiara on her head. Then she would join her family for breakfast in the grand dining hall, where they ate from golden plates and drank from jeweled cups. But Elena often felt lonely in this world of luxury. She watched through her tall windows as children played in the village below. They laughed and ran freely while she had to walk slowly and speak quietly like a proper princess. The palace rules said she could never leave without at least 20 royal guards surrounding her. She could never speak to common people unless it was an official royal event. And she certainly could never do anything that might embarrass the royal family. The royal guards were the most serious men in the entire kingdom. They wore heavy armor and carried sharp swords. Their job was to protect the royal family from any danger. Captain Marcus led the guard. He was a tall, stern man who had served the royal family for 20 years. He never smiled and always stood perfectly straight. The other guards looked up to him and followed his every command without question. Elena's parents, King Richard and Queen Isabella, reminded her daily about her responsibilities. They told her that being a princess meant sacrificing personal desires for the good of the kingdom. She had to marry a prince from another kingdom to create political alliances. She had to attend boring ceremonies and smile even when she felt sad. Most importantly, she could never show weakness or emotion in public because it would make the royal family look bad. Every day felt the same for Elena. She would attend morning lessons with her tutor, who taught her about other kingdoms and proper royal behavior. Then she would have lunch with visiting nobles who talked about politics and trade agreements. In the afternoon, she would practice dancing and music. Evenings were reserved for formal dinners with important guests. Elena felt like she was living someone else's life. The palace servants were kind to Elena, but they always kept their distance. They would bow deeply whenever she walked by and speak only when spoken to. Elena wished she could have real conversations with them, but the royal rules forbade it. She often wondered what their lives were like outside the palace walls. Did they have families? What made them happy or sad? She had so many questions but no way to get answers. One particular morning, Elena woke up feeling more restless than usual. She had dreamed about running through fields of flowers with children from the village. In her dream, she was wearing simple clothes and her hair flowed freely in the wind. She felt truly happy for the first time in years. But when she opened her eyes, she was back in her golden cage. As her servants prepared her for another day of royal duties, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She looked at herself in the mirror, wearing another expensive dress that felt heavy and uncomfortable. The tiara on her head felt like a burden rather than a symbol of honor. She realized that she had never made a single choice about her own life. Everything had been decided for her before she was even born. That morning, as Elena walked to the breakfast hall with her usual escort of royal guards, she noticed something that made her heart ache. Through one of the palace windows, she saw a small girl crying in the courtyard below. The child was poorly dressed and looked very hungry. She was alone and seemed frightened by all the guards and palace workers walking around her. Elena stopped walking immediately when she saw the crying child. The royal guards behind her almost bumped into each other because they weren't expecting her to stop. Captain Marcus stepped forward with a concerned look on his face. He was always worried when the princess did anything unexpected, because it was his job to keep her safe and on schedule. The little girl in the courtyard looked to be about 7 years old. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and she had no shoes on her feet. Tears streamed down her face as she stood in the middle of the busy courtyard, completely lost and scared. Palace workers hurried past her without stopping to help. They were all too busy with their own important tasks to notice one small, frightened child. Elena's heart broke as she watched the scene. She had lived her entire life surrounded by luxury and comfort, never wanting for anything. But this child clearly needed help, and everyone was ignoring her. Elena knew that if she were in the same situation, dozens of people would rush to help her immediately. The unfairness of the situation made her feel angry and sad at the same time. Captain Marcus cleared his throat politely. He reminded Elena that they were already running late for breakfast and that the king and queen were waiting for her. The other guards stood in perfect formation, their faces showing no emotion. They had been trained to focus only on their duty to protect the princess, not to get involved in other matters. But Elena couldn't stop looking at the crying child. She remembered all the lessons her tutor had taught her about being a good ruler. A true leader, she had learned, should care about all the people in their kingdom, especially those who couldn't help themselves. Elena had always thought these were just words in books, but now she was seeing a real situation where she could make a difference. The princess asked Captain Marcus who the child was and how she had gotten into the palace courtyard. The captain looked uncomfortable and explained that sometimes poor children from the village wandered onto palace grounds looking for food or shelter. Usually the guards would escort them away immediately, but this particular morning had been very busy with preparations for an important ceremony, and the child had somehow been overlooked. Elena learned that the palace protocol in such situations was simple. The guards would remove the child from the premises and return her to the village. They wouldn't hurt her, but they wouldn't help her either. It wasn't their responsibility to solve the problems of every poor person who came to the palace. Captain Marcus explained this in a matter-of-fact way, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. As Elena listened to the captain's explanation, she felt something changing inside her. All her life she had been taught that being royal meant following rules and maintaining traditions. But she was starting to realize that maybe being royal should mean something more important. Maybe it should mean using her position to help people who couldn't help themselves. The little girl had stopped crying, but still stood alone in the courtyard. She looked around with wide, frightened eyes, clearly not understanding where she was or what would happen to her next. Elena could see that the child was not just lost, but also very hungry. Her thin face and frail body showed signs that she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Elena made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of continuing to the breakfast hall as expected, she turned toward the stairs that led down to the courtyard. Captain Marcus immediately stepped in front of her, blocking her path. He respectfully but firmly reminded her that princesses did not interact directly with common people, especially not with unknown children who might pose a security risk. The other guards moved closer, forming a protective circle around Elena. They were trained to prevent the princess from doing anything that might put her in danger or cause problems for the royal family. Going down to help a strange child was definitely not allowed according to palace protocols. Captain Marcus suggested that if the princess was concerned about the child, he could arrange for the palace staff to handle the situation properly. But Elena had already made up her mind. For the first time in her life, she was going to do what felt right in her heart, instead of what the rules demanded. She looked directly at Captain Marcus and told him that she was going to help the child personally. The captain's face went pale because he had never heard the princess speak with such determination before. What happened next shocked everyone in the palace courtyard. Princess Elena did something that no one expected, and that broke every rule of royal behavior. Without waiting for permission or approval from anyone, she reached up and removed her beautiful tiara from her head. The precious crown, worth more than most people earned in their entire lives, glittered in the morning sunlight as she held it in her hands. The royal guard stood frozen in complete disbelief. Captain Marcus's mouth fell open as he watched the princess do something that went against everything he had been taught about protecting the royal family's dignity. The other guards looked at each other in confusion, not knowing whether they should stop her or let her continue. Nothing in their training had prepared them for this moment. Elena carefully placed her expensive tiara on the stone steps of the palace. Then she did something even more shocking. She reached down and took off her silk slippers, which were embroidered with gold thread and precious gems. These shoes had been made especially for her by the kingdom's finest craftsmen, and she placed them right next to her tiara as if they were ordinary objects. The princess then walked down the stone steps toward the courtyard in her bare feet. Her long, elegant dress dragged behind her on the rough stones, but she didn't seem to care that it was getting dirty. Every step she took seemed to break another unspoken rule about how royalty should behave. The guards followed her automatically, but they moved like people in a dream, unable to believe what they were seeing. When Elena reached the little girl in the courtyard, she did something that made the guards gasp out loud. Instead of standing tall and maintaining the proper royal posture she had been taught since childhood, Elena knelt down on the dirty stone ground. Her beautiful dress spread around her like a golden pool, and her knees touched the same rough stones where palace horses and carriages passed every day. The little girl looked up at Elena with wide, confused eyes. She had probably never seen such a beautifully dressed person before, but Elena's kind smile made her feel less afraid. Elena spoke to the child in a gentle voice, asking her name and how she had come to be in the palace courtyard. The girl's voice was barely a whisper as she explained that her name was Lucy and that she had been looking for food for her sick mother. Lucy told Elena that her mother had been ill for many days and couldn't work. They had no money left to buy food, and Lucy had heard that sometimes the palace kitchens threw away leftover bread. She had snuck into the courtyard hoping to find something to take home to her mother, but she had gotten lost and scared when she saw all the guards and palace workers. As Elena listened to Lucy's story, tears began to form in her eyes. She had never heard such sadness in a child's voice before. All around them, the royal guard stood like statues watching this impossible scene unfold. Captain Marcus kept looking toward the palace windows, worried that the king and queen might see what was happening and blame him for not controlling the situation. Elena reached into a small pocket hidden in her dress and pulled out a golden bracelet that she always wore. It was a gift from her grandmother and was worth enough money to feed a family for months. Without hesitation, she gently took Lucy's small dirty hand and placed the bracelet in her palm. She told Lucy to take it to the village market and trade it for food and medicine for her mother. The little girl stared at the golden bracelet in amazement. She had never held anything so beautiful or valuable in her entire life. She looked up at Elena with gratitude shining in her eyes, but she seemed afraid to accept such an expensive gift. Elena smiled and closed Lucy's fingers around the bracelet, telling her that it was hers now and that she should never feel ashamed about accepting help when she needed it. But Elena wasn't finished. She stood up and walked back toward the palace steps where she had left her tiara and slippers. The guards watched in continued amazement as she picked up these priceless royal items. Captain Marcus finally found his voice and begged the princess to reconsider whatever she was planning to do. He warned her that the king and queen would be very angry if they discovered what was happening. Elena turned to face Captain Marcus and the other guards with her tiara and slippers in her hands. Her voice was calm but filled with more determination than anyone had ever heard from her before. She told them that she understood their concerns but that she had made a decision that felt right in her heart. She was going to give these royal items to Lucy so that the child could provide for her family's needs. The guards looked at each other in panic. Captain Marcus stepped forward and tried to reason with the princess. He explained that the tiara was a symbol of royal authority that had been passed down through generations. It wasn't just jewelry but a piece of the kingdom's history. Giving it away to a common child would be seen as an insult to the royal family and could cause serious political problems. But Elena had already thought about these concerns. She told Captain Marcus that she believed a true symbol of royal authority should be used to help the people of the kingdom, not just to sit on someone's head during ceremonies. If the tiara could save a family from hunger and sickness, then it was serving a more important purpose than it had ever served before. Elena walked back to Lucy, who was still standing in the courtyard clutching the golden bracelet. The little girl watched with amazement as the beautiful princess knelt down beside her again. Elena gently placed the tiara on the ground next to Lucy and explained that this crown could be traded for enough money to take care of her mother for a very long time. She also placed the silk slippers next to the tiara, telling Lucy that these could provide additional help if needed. Lucy burst into tears, but these were tears of joy and gratitude rather than sadness and fear. She had never imagined that anyone would be so kind to her, especially someone as important as a princess. She tried to thank Elena, but her voice was choked with emotion. Elena hugged the little girl gently and told her that she didn't need to thank her because helping others was what people should do for each other. The scene in the courtyard had attracted attention from palace workers and servants who happened to be passing by. They stopped their work to stare in amazement at what they were witnessing. Some of them recognized the tiara and slippers and couldn't believe that the princess was giving away such valuable royal items. Others were moved by the kindness they were seeing and felt proud to serve a princess with such a generous heart. Captain Marcus realized that he was facing the most difficult situation of his entire career. He was supposed to protect the princess, but how could he protect her from herself? He knew that when the king and queen discovered what had happened, there would be serious consequences. But he also saw something in Princess Elena's eyes that he had never seen before. She looked truly happy for the first time since he had known her. Elena helped Lucy gather the precious items and explained how she could safely travel back to the village. She gave the child detailed instructions about which merchants in the marketplace could be trusted to give fair trades for the royal items. She also made Lucy promise to take good care of herself and her mother, and to never hesitate to ask for help when she needed it. As Lucy prepared to leave the palace courtyard, she turned back to Elena one more time. In her small, clear voice, she told the princess that she was the kindest person she had ever met. She promised that she would never forget what Elena had done for her and her mother. Then she hurried away toward the palace gates, carefully carrying her precious gifts. The guards watched Lucy disappear from sight, and then slowly turned back to look at Princess Elena. She stood in the courtyard wearing her expensive dress, but without her tiara, slippers, or bracelet. Her feet were bare and dirty from walking on the stone ground. Her dress was stained and wrinkled, but her face was shining with a happiness and satisfaction that none of them had ever seen before. Captain Marcus approached Elena carefully. He asked her if she understood the trouble she might be in when her parents discovered what had happened. Elena nodded and said that she did understand, but that she had no regrets about her actions. She had finally done something that felt truly important and meaningful. For the first time in her life, she had used her position as a princess to make a real difference in someone's life. The other guards gathered around Elena and Captain Marcus, still unable to fully process what they had witnessed. They had spent years protecting the princess from danger, but they had never imagined that they might need to protect her from the consequences of her own kindness and generosity. Word of what had happened in the courtyard spread through the palace like wildfire. Servants whispered to each other in the hallways about how Princess Elena had given away her royal tiara and slippers to help a poor child. Some were amazed by her kindness, while others worried about how the king and queen would react to such unprecedented behavior. Captain Marcus knew he had to report the incident to the king and queen immediately. With a heavy heart, he escorted Princess Elena back to the palace, trying to think of the best way to explain what had happened. Elena walked beside him calmly, her bare feet making soft sounds on the marble floors. She seemed completely at peace with her decision, even though she knew she would face serious consequences. When they reached the throne room, King Richard and Queen Isabella were already waiting. News of the incident had reached them through the palace servants, and their faces showed a mixture of shock, anger, and disappointment. Captain Marcus bowed deeply and began to explain the situation, but the king raised his hand to stop him. He wanted to hear the story directly from his daughter. Elena stood before her parents with dignity, despite her disheveled appearance. She told them exactly what had happened and why she had made the choices she did. She explained that she had seen a child in need and felt compelled to help her. She spoke about how wrong it seemed to her that one family should have so much, while another family had nothing at all. King Richard's face grew red with anger as he listened to his daughter's explanation. He reminded Elena that royal items were not personal property to be given away on a whim. The tiara she had given away had belonged to queens of Valdoria for over 200 years. Her actions had not only broken palace rules but had also shown disrespect for centuries of royal tradition. Queen Isabella was equally upset, but her anger came from a different place. She worried about what other kingdoms would think when they heard about Elena's behavior. Royal marriages and political alliances depended on maintaining a proper royal image. If Princess Elena was seen as someone who gave away valuable items to common people, it might make her seem unstable or unfit to be a future queen. Elena listened to her parents' concerns with respect, but she also defended her actions. She told them that she had been taught all her life that royalty came with responsibilities to the people of the kingdom. She had simply tried to fulfill those responsibilities in the most direct way possible. She asked them how giving help to a hungry child could ever be considered wrong or shameful. The argument between Elena and her parents continued for hours. Palace servants could hear raised voices coming from the throne room, though they couldn't make out the exact words being spoken. Captain Marcus and the other guards stood outside the doors, feeling responsible for not preventing the incident but also secretly admiring the princess for her courage. Finally, King Richard announced Elena's punishment. She would be confined to her rooms for 1 month with no contact with anyone except her personal servants. She would miss all royal events and ceremonies during this time. Most importantly, she would never again be allowed to leave the palace without a written plan approved in advance by both the king and queen. Elena accepted her punishment without complaint. As the guards escorted her to her rooms, she held her head high and walked with the same dignity she had always shown. But something fundamental had changed in her. The sadness and restlessness that had always filled her eyes had been replaced by a quiet strength and determination. Over the following days, stories about Princess Elena's act of kindness continued to spread beyond the palace walls. The people in the village heard about how their princess had given away her crown to help a poor child. Instead of being shocked or disapproving, most of them were deeply moved by her actions. They began to see Elena not just as a distant royal figure, but as someone who truly cared about their welfare. Lucy and her mother were able to use the princess's gifts to buy food, medicine, and even a small house in a safer part of the village. Lucy's mother recovered from her illness, and they both started new lives filled with hope and gratitude. Lucy often told people about the kind princess who had changed their lives, and her story inspired others to be more generous and caring toward their neighbors. Meanwhile, in her palace rooms, Elena spent her days reading and thinking about what had happened. She didn't regret her actions, but she began to understand that being a royal who wanted to help people would require more planning and strategy than she had realized. She started to dream about ways she could use her position to make lasting changes that would help many families like Lucy's. The royal guards, especially Captain Marcus, found themselves changed by what they had witnessed. They had always thought their job was simply to protect the royal family from physical danger. But Elena's actions had shown them a different kind of courage and a different way of thinking about what it meant to serve the kingdom. 3 weeks into Elena's confinement, something unexpected happened that would change everything once again. A delegation of nobles and village representatives requested an urgent meeting with the king and queen. They had come to the palace with a petition signed by hundreds of people from throughout the kingdom. The petition asked the royal family to recognize Princess Elena's actions as heroic, rather than shameful. The delegation was led by an elderly nobleman named Lord William, who had served the kingdom faithfully for many years. He explained to the king and queen that Princess Elena's simple act of kindness had inspired a wave of generosity throughout the land. Wealthy families had begun sharing their resources with poor families. Merchants had started donating food to hungry children. The entire kingdom seemed to be discovering the joy that came from helping others. Lord William told the royal couple that the people had begun calling Elena the people's princess because of her compassion and courage. He argued that instead of being punished, she should be celebrated as an example of what true royalty should represent. The delegation presented evidence that crime had decreased in the villages because people were taking better care of each other, inspired by Elena's example. King Richard and Queen Isabella were stunned by this news. They had expected the people to be scandalized by their daughter's behavior, not inspired by it. They had worried that Elena's actions would make the royal family look weak and foolish, but instead it seemed to have made them more beloved than ever before. The petition contained signatures from farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and even some nobles who supported Elena's approach to leadership. The village representatives shared stories about how Elena's actions had affected their communities. Children who had heard Lucy's story were sharing their toys and food with friends who had less. Adults were organizing community projects to help elderly and sick neighbors. The spirit of generosity that Elena had demonstrated in the palace courtyard was spreading like seeds carried by the wind. Captain Marcus was called to testify about what he had witnessed that day in the courtyard. He told the king and queen that he had never seen Princess Elena look as happy and fulfilled as she did when she was helping Lucy. He admitted that while her actions had broken royal protocol, they had also shown a kind of leadership that he had never encountered before. He suggested that perhaps the protocols themselves needed to be reconsidered. After much discussion and consideration, King Richard and Queen Isabella made a decision that surprised everyone, including themselves. They decided to end Elena's confinement early and to publicly support her actions. They announced that the royal family would establish a new tradition of regular charitable activities that would allow them to directly help the people of their kingdom. When Elena was released from her rooms, She was greeted by cheering crowds gathered outside the palace. The people had come from villages throughout the kingdom to show their support for their beloved princess. They sang songs about her kindness and carried banners praising her generous heart. Elena was overwhelmed by the warmth and love she felt from her people. The king and queen organized a special ceremony where they presented Elena with a new tiara, but this one was different from the old one. Instead of being made entirely of precious gems and gold, it incorporated simple flowers and symbols representing the common people of the kingdom. Elena wore this crown with more pride than she had ever felt wearing the traditional royal jewels. From that day forward, Princess Elena became known throughout the land as a new kind of royal leader. She regularly visited villages to help with community projects. She established programs to ensure that no child in the kingdom would go hungry or lack medical care. She used her position not just for ceremonies and political meetings, but as a force for positive change in people's daily lives. Captain Marcus and the royal guards found their duties expanded as well. Instead of just protecting the princess from danger, they began helping her carry out her charitable missions. They discovered that this new kind of service was more rewarding than they had ever imagined. They felt proud to serve a princess who truly cared about making the world better for everyone. Years later, when Elena became queen, she was remembered not for the expensive crown she had given away, but for the simple act of kindness that had transformed an entire kingdom. Her reign was marked by prosperity, peace, and a spirit of community that lasted for generations. The people never forgot that their queen was someone who had once knelt on dirty stones to help a frightened child, proving that true nobility came from the heart rather than from a crown. Lucy grew up to become a teacher who told Elena's story to every class she taught. She wanted children to understand that one person's kindness could create ripples of positive change that spread far beyond what anyone could imagine. The golden bracelet that Elena had given her was displayed in the village school as a reminder that generosity and compassion were the most valuable treasures anyone could possess.